his medical career in Kenya, ophthalmologist Dr. James Muecke, AM, has been passionate about fighting blindness. In 2000, he co-founded Vision Myanmar at the South Australian Institute of Ophthalmology. Inspired by this program's success, James also co-founded Sight for All, a social impact organisation aiming to create a world where everyone can see. With 80% of world blindness avoidable and almost 90% in underprivileged countries, James treats blindness as a human rights issue. Australian of the Year 2020, Dr. Muecke's passion for the preservation of eyesight is demonstrated by his commitment to such programs in developing nations, and now he has directed it here, the privileged nation of Australia, where people are losing their sight as a consequence of preventable lifestyle disease, type 2 diabetes. Welcome to Pure Health Hub, James.
Thanks, Bernie. Lovely to be here this morning.
Thank you. Now, we thought we'd just make it a bit of a sort of a relaxed chat this morning. And what I wanted to do really was learn more about the Australian Dietary Guidelines, which have been, I guess, fed to us for a long time as being this fabulous framework and model for a healthy lifestyle. But as a type 2 diabetic, I was diagnosed nearly 3 years ago, and I'm sort of working through that. I've discovered a lot myself about how carbs and obviously sugar, we all know that sugar is basically a toxin. But, you know, I think we're being fed stuff that I'm a bit concerned about and concerned for my fellow type 2 diabetics. So I wanted to talk to you this morning and try and dispel some myths and share a little bit of information about that. So your irrepressible mission, I guess what I want to start with is you're an ophthalmologist and yet you're advocating for type 2 diabetics. Can you tell me how you got there here? What is this mantle? How did you pick it up?
Sure. Well, as an ophthalmologist, as an eye surgeon, for 33 years that I've been in this profession, I've been dealing with the consequences that diabetes inflicts on the eye. So what I've noticed over those 33 years is the growth in the number of patients with type 2 diabetes and the number of patients I'm treating, trying to prevent them from going blind. And it's quite a disturbing rise that I've noticed over the years. And I have encountered patients who have lost vision, even gone blind due to their diabetes. And it's truly disturbing to see, as an eye specialist, realizing this 98% of the loss of vision and blindness in diabetes, so this is all types of diabetes, is preventable or treatable, it's avoidable. So it just should not be happening. And if you realize that the majority of diabetes is type 2 diabetes, this is a largely avoidable man-made dietary disease. And really, we should not be seeing this degree of vision loss in our society. There are about 100,000 people in Australia with sight-threatening eye disease due to diabetes. Wow. If you realise that there's close to 2 million people in this country with diabetes and well over half of them are not having their regular eye checks, that's why it's such a blinding problem in our society now. So initially, a few years ago, I was really very focused on trying to turn around that terrible statistic, encourage people to have their eyes checked so that we didn't see people losing vision going blind due to diabetes. But really, it's evolved since that time into really looking at the root cause of type 2 diabetes, which is our poor diet.
Yes, and coming back to that poor diet is really, we talk about the Australian Dietary Guidelines, which is the framework for hospitals, schools, you know, all the fundamental facilities that we have in terms of teaching people the right way of living, and yet you see it as being, you know, you seem to be outing it as being flawed, biased and unscientific. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
So the dietary guidelines, the current version, the current draft has been in place for 10 years. They're currently under review at the moment. The current draft continues to discourage the consumption of natural saturated fats, and yet there's no strong evidence to say that natural saturated fats, such as found in foods like full-fat dairy, eggs, red meat, there's no link between consumption of natural saturated fats and cardiovascular disease. And yet guidelines continue to discourage in favour of margarines and seed oils. They recommend those as healthy fats, but actually the evidence suggests that seed oils, which we euphemistically call vegetable oils, so canola, safflower, sunflower, things like that, are not healthy. And they're a driver of the core metabolic dysfunction, which is what we call insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is the driver of all of this. And the two major metabolic disruptors that drive insulin resistance are the fructose component of sugar and the seed oils. And if we realize that the major components of ultra-processed foods, which now make up something like 62% of the calories in the American diet, over 50% in the UK, and I suspect we're pushing close to 50% of our own diet, the major components are sugar, refined carbohydrates, and seed oils. Then this is really just like a loaded gun that's pointing at our livers, causing metabolic dysfunction, driving insulin resistance, driving prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and all of the horrendous complications, including loss of sight.
Yeah. It's extraordinary, isn't it? Because as you say, the evidence is there to talk about, particularly grains and, as you say, the seed oils and things like that. And yet it's still being ignored by government and the dietary organizations. Why is that? Do you think it's going to be ignored in this updated version, or is it going to be incorporated? What do you think?
I really hope not, because we need to move in the right direction. I mean, in the defense of the guidelines, they say that they're for the average healthy Australian. They say that on the first page, I think. But when you realise that over 2/3 of Australian adults are overweight or obese, and about a quarter of our kids. So the majority of Australians are not healthy. So this guideline, which is being used by organisations such as Diabetes Australia to recommend to people with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, it's being used by the College of GPs to recommend people with type 2 diabetes eat by Australian guidelines, and a bunch of other health associations are recommending it. Then clearly, it's the wrong advice. This is in essence, a high carb eating recommendation. And if you realize that insulin resistance simply means that we are unable to metabolize, to process the glucose load entering the body, and glucose, sugar, is simply a carbohydrate, then if you are intolerant of carbohydrates, then the last thing people should be consuming is bucket loads of carbohydrates. And yet that's what our guidelines is recommending. If you realize then that the major metabolic dysfunction, the big baddie is type 2 diabetes, but it's really it's a continuum. It's just a spectrum of increasing metabolic dysfunction. That if reducing the carbohydrates is the best way to tackle type 2 diabetes, it's the best way to tackle prediabetes, it's the best way to tackle a fatty liver, insulin resistance, and then really this is the dietary pattern that most people should be following for a healthy life.
Yeah, anybody, right? Not just people who are sitting in this diabetic sort of phase. So, carbs, and I think that was probably one of my downfalls. But it is learning to eat again, because I think we know that sugar, right? I mean, refined sugars, we know that that's bad for us, but we just don't seem to get this correlation between our ability to process or not process properly these carbs, and that's exactly what it turns into, is the sugar, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, particularly the refined carbohydrates, so highly refined white flour and white rice and white flour, peel white potatoes. All they are virtually pure starch. And starch is simply long chains of glucose, which break down into single molecules of glucose once they reach the gut. In fact, it's a process that begins when these products enter the mouth. So when you're consuming starch, and we're being recommended to consume starch, then you're just consuming glucose, you're consuming sugar. And then once again, if you realize that the majority of us are insulin resistant, we're intolerant of carbs, that is not the way we should be eating. So, if we want to just keep it simple, we should, if we really want to, so there's two main things here. I think one is that type 2 diabetes is largely preventable, and it's also potentially reversible. If you prefer the term remission, we can potentially put type 2 diabetes into remission, and they're slightly different things. But I think if we look at prevention, if we recommend to people the best way, particularly if they have type 2 diabetes in the family, then they're at a higher risk. The best way to prevent them going on to develop prediabetes and type 2 diabetes is to avoid sugary drinks, and that includes fruit juices, energy drinks, iced teas, flavored milk, all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Reduce their consumption, just be aware of the added sugars in their diet, avoid the seed oils, which I mentioned before are metabolic disruptors, and avoid ultra processed foods. And if we did that, the vast majority of us would be in a much healthier place. And there's a bunch of other things beyond diet that you can do as well. I have a phase of time-restricted eating every day. So I have a 16-8 fast. So that basically means that I eat within an 8-hour window. So from about 7 o'clock in the evening through to 1 o'clock the next day, I don't eat, which pretty much just means that I don't have breakfast. And when you have that short, sharp fast, your insulin level drops, and insulin is actually a fat storage hormone. So when your insulin level drops, you're actually mobilizing fat from the body's stores. So it's a great way to be an adjunct to have a healthier way of having a healthier lifestyle. And there are a bunch of other things. I mean, getting a good night's sleep is really important. Trying to minimize stress is critical. And also, as we age, we do lose muscle tone, and sarcopenia is a real problem in the elderly, because it leads to frailty, fragility, falls and fractures. And so, in making sure that we prioritize protein to retain our muscle mass, and resistance training to help build up muscle mass again is also a very important thing to do.
Yeah. Now, coming back to the fasting, the intermittent fasting that you were talking about. Now, gosh, it's been a journey in this whole sort of 3 years of trying to understand, because I've got to be honest, GPs know very little, or the ones that I've been to know very little about type 2 in terms of, how you should be doing it. And of course, come back to the Australian Dietary Guidelines. And, so it's been a very difficult, and it's been a huge learning curve for me. And what I found at one point was, I needed to eat more frequently, because I felt like it was my bloods were sort of going like this. I now have a CGM, thankfully, a continuous glucose monitor. So that's helping me sort of understand how that's working. Tell me about this intermittent fasting. Tell me a little bit more about it, and how it benefits type 2 and how it benefits generally our life, our health.
Yeah, there's lots of ways you can do it. You can have a very calorie restricted couple of days. So some people do this sort of 5-2 fast, where on a couple of days a week they reduce their calories to a really, really low level. But I, as I say, quite simply like this sort of 16-8 fast, because during that 16-hour period, your insulin level drops and you mobilize fat from the body's stores. And there are also other potential benefits for longevity, which arise as a result of fasting. And there's some extraordinary studies as well, where people who have tumors and cancers, who have quite rigorous fasting in combination with a very low carbohydrate diet, what we call a ketogenic diet, can actually help as an adjunct in cancer treatment as well. So I think fasting is very, very important, but as you say, not many people know about it. And my son was in medical school, is in medical school, he's in 5th year at the moment, but in 2nd year, he had the opportunity to do nutrition as an elective. So it's not even being taught in our major training grounds. So most GPs are not aware of these sorts of things. I think it's getting out into the press a bit more, and people are interested in it. But I think it's certainly a great adjunct for people who want to potentially lose weight or turn around their type 2 diabetes. It's a useful thing. But I think one of the important things that people need to be aware of, if they do do an intermittent fast, or if they do let's say take on a low carbohydrate or a ketogenic diet, what we call therapeutic carbohydrate reduction, to hopefully put their type 2 diabetes into remission, is to ensure, as I was saying before, they maximize their protein intake so that they don't get into this potential problem area of losing muscle mass. So it's definitely a great adjunct. Some people don't like giving up their breakfast, and that's fine, but prioritize protein for breakfast. Don't prioritize cereals and grains and carbohydrates. So it won't do them any favors if they're metabolically dysfunctional.
No, absolutely. And since I've had this, it's been eye-opening in many ways in terms of, I mean, I knew grains were a thing, but I almost been testing things like cereal the other morning. It went through the roof, and you just can't have your blood sugars doing those sorts of things. Because I think, as I think I was watching you the other day and was talking about what does an erratic blood sugar level do for you? What does it do? What are the negatives to an erratic blood sugar level?
Oh, well, that's right. So let's say if you have your glass of fruit juice and your bowl of cereal and your fruit and your fruit yogurt for breakfast, you'll get a spike in your blood glucose. And people have heard about the glycemic index, but probably, or definitely more important, is the glycemic load, because cereals and grains will result in a spike in blood glucose, which is often more sustained and potentially more harmful, because what happens on the back of the spike in glucose is you get a spike in insulin to try and move that glucose into every cell of our body. So you get the spike in glucose, the spike in insulin, and then you go hypoglycemic as the insulin moves all that glucose and shoves it into the cells. And then you after a couple of hours, you then go into your sugar cravings, and you have this roller coaster throughout the day. But the most satiating macronutrients are healthy fats and proteins. And so if you prioritize those for breakfast as opposed to carbs and sugars, then you won't have those erratic highs and lows in blood sugar. And you'll find that you will stay satiated through till lunchtime.
Yeah.
But with my intermittent fast, I found that, for a week, I started doing it for the first time really 3 years ago, and it took me about a week, and I was pretty hungry come lunchtime, but then it becomes the norm, and then after that I was quite comfortable with not having breakfast through till lunchtime. I had my coffee in the morning, and that's about it, and I do quite well. But as I say, it's not for everyone. But if you like it and can handle it, then it's a really good adjunct, I think.
Then it's been effective for you, hasn't it? I think the other thing about, obviously, the lows are scary, right? They're really scary. So it's happened to me 2 or 3 times. And, you feel like you're going to pass out. Obviously, you can go into a coma. I am trying to, explain these very serious impact of type 2 diabetes. But also I was reading recently that it can, this constant changing of your blood sugar levels. Obviously, there's things like your blood circulation and things like that, where, amputations are not uncommon. But apparently there's an effect on your brain if you've had this constant blood glucose level. Is that true, or am I making that up?
Yes, well, we know that unfortunately about 70% of people with diabetes will ultimately develop dementia. So if we're looking at they talk about loss of sight, blindness being the most feared complication, loss of limb, gangrene resulting in amputations being the second most feared complication. I actually lost both parents to dementia, not as a result of type 2 diabetes, but dementia is a horrendous disease, and it impacts so broadly, not just on the individual, but on the entire family. Then actually, this is, to me, the most feared complication. And there's a whole bunch of other complications that we see in type 2 diabetes. And there's, we can dig deeply into the pathophysiology behind all of that, but really there are 2 core pathophysiological effects, which is damage to the internal lining of the blood vessels throughout the body, what we call the endothelial glycocalyx, and that allows fluid to leak from the bloodstream into the tissues, and in essence, sugary fluid. And that glucose within that fluid binds to proteins in the tissues and causes structural damage. So leakage of fluid into the tissues is a driver of pathology in the body. And in my profession, ophthalmology, I have the opportunity, and it's an incredible opportunity, to be able to look inside the eye and see the damage being done. We can see fluid leaking into the tissue of the central vision area, causing what we call macular edema. The other major pathophysiological impact is blockage of blood vessels. And that has drivers as well. And when you have blockage of blood vessels, you have a lack of oxygen flow, ischemia, and that also we see in the eye, and that can result in blockage of oxygen flow to large areas of the retina, and as a response you get new blood vessels growing into the retina and into the jelly of the eye, and they're fragile and they can bleed suddenly and take the vision away. So those are the two major effects, but this is happening throughout the body. This isn't just exclusively in the eyes. We just have the opportunity to see it, and so it's,
and that's the thing. I think, you know, if our GP, and it wasn't what I was trying to get to before, is if our GPs are not really able to explain the impact of type 2, you know, clearly, then what help have we got? What hope have we got? I mean, you know, so that's why it's been really important to me. Obviously, I've been on a journey of, you know, research and trying to understand it more, and, you know, what I can do. Now, you did mention before, though, you talked about it being reversible or in remission. And this, of course, is a debate. There seems to be a different train of thought for all of this. In your view, obviously you said reversible, and you believe it is?
Absolutely. I think some people prefer the term remission, and we shouldn't be, let's say, considering it a cure as such.
No.
The remission is a bit like cancer treatment. Being able to put the cancer into remission doesn't mean that it's cured and that you have to continue to be very careful. But there's no doubt that it works. There are over 100 controlled clinical trials that show that you can potentially prevent and put type 2 diabetes into remission. And we now have studies out to 5 years. The Verta study out of the US showing that 50% of people are still in remission at the 5-year mark. And there's no doubt that it works. I was on the National Diabetes Strategy Working Group, and I was able to get remission of type 2 diabetes into that document for the first time in 2021. Once I had that in the document, I then started having the conversation with my patients. I have, let's say somewhere 150 patients with sight-threatening eye disease due to their diabetes, and the first 100 that I had that conversation with, were you aware that you've put your type 2 into remission? Only one of that first 100 was actually aware. So this is a conversation that is not happening. No. Anyway, so I started working with a nutritionist in Adelaide, well, actually, initially what I did was write back to the GP saying, can we explore this amazing opportunity with our mutual patient? Sadly, most of those letters were ignored, but fortunately some took it on board, and we started working with a nutritionist in Adelaide, and then we were putting a number of patients' diabetes into remission. I now have quite a number, and it's been, for me in my 40-year medical career, one of the most exciting, if not the most exciting experience I've had. So I actually have patients that regularly are coming back to see me with eye disease, retinal disease due to their diabetes, who are having regular injections inside the eyes, sometimes every 4 weeks in both eyes.
I mean, that on its own has got to be scary enough, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But it's not for everyone. So patients coming back regularly for injections, and in the patients that attempted to put their type 2 diabetes to remission, it was amazing. I still remember the very first patient coming back. He was having 3 monthly injections in both eyes, and then he went off to see the nutritionist, then came back, and he was off his insulin, and then the next time he came back and he was off all his medicines, and I remember him distinctly saying, I've never felt so good. And what I've noticed, and that was probably a couple of years ago now, and over the last couple of years, we've been able to get his injections out to 6 monthly. And I suspect in the next few months we'll come off his injections altogether by putting his diabetes into remission, allowing the healing of blood vessels. So it's super exciting, and I'm seeing this virtually across the board. I looked at it last week. I have over 50 patients now, and not all of them will put their type 2 diabetes into remission, but they've all managed to reduce their intake of sugar and carbs and seed oils, and actually almost universally, we're seeing an improvement in the swelling, the macular edema involving the central vision area. So there's no doubt it works. This is remission in action.
So there really is a remission even for that damage that's been done to the eye. I thought at least, you get your blood sugars sort of more stable and under the sort of 5 mark or whatever. But you're saying actually, if you're really committed to this, doing it properly, really living properly, living well, you can even reverse some of that damage.
Yeah. No question about it, and I've just doing some studies at the moment, and we'll be publishing those very soon. Let's say if someone has, we mentioned before, the swelling of the macula, you can also get ischemic damage to the macula due to the diabetes. So if there's significant ischemia, you're not going to be able to reverse that swelling in some people, but even with a mild degree of ischemia, what we do notice as the healing of the blood vessels and the reduction in leakage due to reducing carb and sugar intake is that we are seeing a reduction in the swelling, as I say, almost universally. So it's there's no doubt it's happening. If there's really advanced damage, there's certainly no way that we can reverse that. But what we're noticing, not just in the eyes, we're noticing people with foot ulcers that reduce their carb intake and seed oil intake, that there's improvements there. People with a coronary artery calcium score are able to reduce there's anecdotal reports on people improving their coronary artery calcium score. There are people who are improving their renal function. Renal failure is a problem with type 2 diabetes. It's the leading cause of renal failure, but we're seeing improved renal function in people who adopt this approach as well, et cetera, et cetera. And there's we know that about 50% of people with type 2 diabetes will have mental health issues, and sometimes very severe ones. And we know also that therapeutic carbohydrate reduction can help turn around significant mental health conditions. So what we're finding almost universally that this is helping people, and it absolutely needs to be adopted and discussed with every patient with type 2 diabetes ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think coming back to that carbs, it really is a concern in terms of what, it being so well spruiked by government. I remember I feel like I've grown up with this, the top 5 things that you should be eating, and, carbs was a big part of that. I think it might have been the biggest one at the bottom. I can't remember, but, they're spruiking it. Is there any reason, is there a connection between, and I'm going to be honest, the conflicts of interest, the profit over health? Is there any kind of correlation there that you see it as being detrimental? Are they going to be able to just turn around next issue of these new guidelines and remove, the refined carbohydrates and things? Is that going to happen, or is there too many people invested in this whole thing?
Oh, there's huge and widespread investment. There's no question about that. And actually, if tomorrow a new dietary guideline came about and it was a complete about flip, which it really should be, then it would wreak economic devastation on individuals, on organisations, entire sectors. So this is something that's going to have to happen slowly. Now, if you realise South Australia, where I'm from, our biggest export is wheat. We have a huge orange juice industry as well. It's going to take time for this to move in the right direction. So I don't think we're going to see a complete flip. But I think if we're all banging from the same drum that we should be minimising our consumption of sugary drinks and ultra processed foods, basically nutrient poor, energy dense consumables, then this is the direction that we should be heading in, I think, at this point in time.
Yeah. And absolutely.
And I've got this concept called the 5 A's of sugar toxicity, which you may have heard before, which is one of the things I think that really, I came up with this concept 3 years ago when I was thinking about this more deeply to try and explain, why we're in this scenario. So the 5 A's: addiction. So sugar is highly addictive, as addictive as nicotine, and it's driving the consumption of sugary beverages and ultra processed foods. And the second A is alleviation. We often use sugary products to alleviate stress, to make us feel better when we're down. Third A is accessibility. We are being bombarded everywhere we go. You can't check out from most supermarket stores, even chemists these days, without being enticed by half-price chocolates and sugary drinks. Fourth A is addition. Something like 3/4 of our food and drinks have added sugar. And finally, advertising. This predatory marketing that's going on everywhere in our environment. So even with people who are trying to do the right thing and minimise their consumption of sugary products and ultra-processed products, when your food environment is and the processed food and sugary drinks industry are the culprits here. They're preying on people who are vulnerable. They're preying on people who are addicted, preying on our kids. Then this absolutely has to stop. We need some accountability here to help people who are trying to do the right thing and avoid these consumables.
And that's precisely it. But I think, the obvious ones like the chocolates at the checkout and the drinks and, orange juices and the soft drinks. But there is so much sugar in things that we don't even realize. I was always sort of pretty good at looking at them, but obviously after being diagnosed, I read everything. You try to pick up a low-fat yogurt and it's got 17 grams of sugar and all of these products that are supposed to be healthy, which is the other big frustration, right? So
yeah. Well, certainly when the Dietary Guidelines for Americans came out in 1980, which recommended reducing our consumption of fats and increasing our consumption of starch, which was based on flawed evidence and was corrupted. As a fascinating story there, which you can read about in Nina Teicholz's book, Big Fat Surprise. But this was adopted worldwide, this high carb, low fat eating approach. And so when you take fat out of food or fat out of the diet, you take away its flavor, you take away its ability to satiate you. And that's why sugar and carbs replace that, because otherwise it'd be like eating cardboard. So, these low fat products are not healthy for us because they're full of sugars and carbs in many respects.
Yeah. It's really important that we keep an eye on everything that really comes in a packet.
Yeah, absolutely. And sauces, condiments, jams, all of those sorts. Just have a look at that. And there are something like 56 common names for sugar. I think there's 260 odd names for sugar, but 56 common ones that are really just confuse the consumer even more. So you have to be wary of all those names and scrutinize every label, but it makes it tough. But I think ultimately, if you just eat whole food, real food, then avoid these packaged rubbish.
Yeah, I think that's it. And I think, to try and keep it as simple as, and it is simple, really. I mean, ultimately, I know I'm going, I started off really well and got everything back to 5, and then all sorts of things were happening. So now it's all gone a bit crazy. So things do change, but one thing that keeps it easy is just making sure that we stay committed to unpackaged foods, basically unprocessed, unpackaged. And if we do make it and nothing white, and if we do try to keep it that simple, then I think we're on the right track. James, your leadership, determination, passion obviously has improved eye health and helped alleviate poverty and disadvantage in many communities. Hopefully Australians can learn from your advocacy work in bringing in devastating reality of this preventable disease, type 2 diabetes. I know I've learned a lot today. Thank you so much for your time, James. I really appreciate it.
Oh, pleasure, Lindy. And thank you also for everything you're doing. I mean, being a person with lived experience, you have a very powerful voice, and raising awareness is really critical here. It's what's needed very broadly. So thank you for what you're doing.
Oh, pleasure. Thanks so much. Great to chat with you.
Bye.
Bye.